A powerful pastor, a devoted wife, a love story rooted in faith and built for the world to admire. To their congregation, they were the perfect couple. They were a symbol of purity and righteousness, a divine example of what God intended for marriage. Their lavish wedding was celebrated by hundreds, their vows spoken with conviction, their union blessed by the heavens. But behind closed doors, beneath the carefully crafted image, there was a secret. A secret so devastating that when it finally came to light, it didn't just destroy their marriage, it ended in a brutal, blood-soaked tragedy. How does a man go from preaching about love to committing an unthinkable act of violence? How does a woman who spent her life serving others become the victim of the man who once promised to protect her? And what was the one truth that shattered their so-called perfect life? This is the story of Khalil Barksdale and Amina Holloway, a tale of faith, deception, and a murder so horrific that it sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of their church. But before we get into the chilling details, make sure to like this video and subscribe, where we uncover the darkest secrets hiding behind seemingly perfect lives. Now, let's begin. Khalil Barksdale was a man of God, or at least, that's what the world believed. At 36, he had built himself into a force to be reckoned with. A self-proclaimed prophet from Houston, Texas, his sermons were fiery, filled with passion, fear, and conviction. He didn't just preach, he commanded. Thousands followed him, hung on his every word, desperate for his approval, his blessings, his touch. He claimed to heal the sick, cast out demons, and deliver the lost. To his congregation, he wasn't just a pastor, he was a chosen vessel, a man anointed by God himself. And then there was Amina Holloway. At 28, she was everything a woman of faith was expected to be: kind, humble, devoted. But she was also fiercely independent, a woman with a purpose. A social worker dedicated to underprivileged youth, she spent her days fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, giving hope to the hopeless. She had a past, like anyone, but she was determined not to let it define her. Before Khalil, Amina had known heartbreak. She had given her love to the wrong man once before, Xavier. A serial cheater, a liar, a man who fed her sweet words while betraying her in the worst way possible. And his betrayal cost her more than just her trust, it cost her her health. When Amina found out she had contracted HIV because of Xavier's reckless infidelity, her world shattered. But she wasn't the kind of woman to break. She picked up the pieces, took control of her health, and moved forward. With the right medication, her condition was manageable, undetectable. But the stigma? The fear of rejection? That never went away. And then, she met Khalil. It was 3 years ago at a church convention in Dallas. Khalil was the star of the event, a guest speaker delivering one of his electrifying sermons. Amina sat in the crowd, watching him, listening to him, feeling something stir inside her. His conviction, his confidence, it was magnetic. When their paths finally crossed, there was an instant connection. Khalil saw in her everything he had ever preached about, a Proverbs 31 woman, virtuous, strong, a woman molded by God himself. Amina saw something too, a man of faith, a leader, someone who could love her in the way she had always prayed for. Their courtship was strict, just as Khalil believed it should be. No late-night visits, no alone time without accountability, no premarital sex. They prayed together, fasted together, built their relationship on what they both believed were solid, godly principles. To Khalil, Amina was pure, untouched, everything a man of God could hope for in a wife. Their love story became something of a phenomenon. The perfect Christian couple, disciplined, devoted, a shining example of what it meant to honor God in a relationship. When Khalil proposed, it was a grand event, shared across social media, celebrated by thousands. Amina is the perfect Proverbs 31 wife. Khalil is a true man of God. Their love is pure, unbreakable. That's what everyone believed. That's what they were supposed to be. But what happens when a love built on faith is tested by a truth too heavy to bear? What happens when the image of perfection begins to crack? Because secrets don't stay buried forever. And when the truth finally comes to light, it won't just shake the foundation of their marriage, it will lead to a tragedy so horrifying that no prayer could ever undo it. Amina Holloway had spent years rebuilding herself. She had learned to live with the weight of her past, to move forward despite the scars Xavier had left behind. The day she was diagnosed with HIV felt like the end of her world, but she refused to let it define her. She did everything right, got on medication, stayed undetectable, kept herself healthy. And for the most part, she convinced herself that she was fine. That she was whole. Then she met Khalil. From the moment they locked eyes at the church convention, everything changed. Khalil made her believe in love again, in second chances. He was everything she had prayed for, strong, faithful, a man of God who valued commitment and purity. But there was one problem. He didn't know the truth. Amina told herself she would tell him. In the beginning, she thought she had time. It was just talking, just prayer meetings, just long phone calls that stretched into the early hours of the morning. But then came the courtship, the engagement, the expectations of a perfect Christian union. And with each milestone, the window to confess seemed to close a little more. She would sit across from him at dinner, rehearsing the words in her head. "Khalil, before we go any further, there's something I need to tell you." But then he would reach for her hand, smile at her, tell her how grateful he was to have found a woman so pure, so untouched by the world's corruption. And just like that, the words would die in her throat. She convinced herself that silence was mercy. She had been undetectable for years, her doctors assured her that she couldn't transmit the virus. As long as she stayed healthy, as long as she was careful, what did it matter? She wasn't a danger to Khalil. She wasn't lying, not really. She was just protecting their future. But the guilt was suffocating. Nights before the wedding, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, fighting the war inside her. The rational part of her knew the truth would destroy everything. Khalil was not a man of compromise. His sermons made that clear. He believed in absolute purity, in living without blemish. And even though she had done nothing wrong, even though she had been a victim, she knew how he would see it. He would see her as tainted. And she couldn't bear to lose him. So, she told herself one last lie, it won't matter. As long as I stay healthy, as long as he never finds out, it won't matter. The wedding was nothing short of perfection. Hundreds filled the grand church in Houston, dressed in their finest, eager to witness what many called a union blessed by God. The ceremony was streamed online, shared thousands of times by those who saw Khalil and Amina as the epitome of a righteous, holy marriage. Khalil Barksdale stood at the altar, draped in an ivory suit, his presence commanding, his expression serene yet filled with purpose. He was the self-proclaimed prophet, the shepherd of thousands, and today, he was claiming his wife. Amina Holloway floated down the aisle, delicate and graceful, the picture of a virtuous bride. The whispers among the women in the congregation spoke of her poise, her modesty, her role as the ultimate Proverbs 31 wife. Men admired Khalil's choice, a woman so pure, so devout, untouched by the corruption of the world. "I have found a good thing," Khalil declared as he placed the ring on her finger, his voice carrying through the cathedral like prophecy itself. The crowd erupted in applause, hands lifted in praise, tears streaming down the faces of those who saw their love as divine. Their wedding photos flooded social media, captions filled with scripture, affirmations, and declarations of God's favor. From the outside, they were perfect. Untouchable. An example of what Christian marriage should be, but Amina knew better. She told herself that night, after the celebration, after the toasts and prayers, after the last guests had gone home, that she had made the right decision. That this was the life God had given her, and she would protect it at all costs. 2 days later, they arrived in Miami for their honeymoon. A 5-star resort, an ocean view suite, and nothing but time to enjoy their new life together. The evening had been peaceful, the scent of salt water drifting through the open balcony doors, the distant sound of waves crashing against the shore. Inside, Khalil was unpacking Amina's luggage, placing her neatly folded dresses into the closet when something at the bottom of her suitcase caught his eye. A small, familiar blue bottle. Truvada. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The weight of it felt unnatural, heavy, wrong. The label confirmed his worst fear. He turned slowly, the bottle clenched in his fist. Amina. His voice was low, dangerously calm. She had just stepped out of the bathroom, her hair damp, her silk robe tied loosely at her waist. But at the sight of the pill bottle in his hands, her entire body went still. His heart pounded as he stepped forward, holding up the bottle. "What is this?" Amina opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Answer me." She flinched at the force of his voice. "Khalil, please. Let me explain." "Explain what?" "Why my wife, my virtuous wife, has HIV medication in her suitcase." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was diagnosed 2 years ago." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. "It was my ex, Xavier. He cheated on me. I didn't know until it was too late." Khalil's stomach lurched. "You knew? Before we got married? And you never told me?" His words were strangled, barely holding back the rage boiling inside him. "I was scared," Amina whispered. "Khalil, I swear, I've never put you at risk. I take my medication every day. My doctor told me." "Your doctor?" His laugh was hollow, humorless. "What about your husband? Did he deserve to know? Or did you just assume your little pills would make up for your lies?" Amina's lip trembled. "I didn't lie. I didn't tell you yet." "That's the same damn thing." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Amina reached for him, but he jerked away. "Khalil, please. I need to get tested." His voice was dead, emotionless. "Right now. Khalil, listen to me. I'm undetectable. That means. I don't care what it means." His roar echoed through the suite. "I am a pastor. A leader. And you, he ran a shaking hand over his face. "You've defiled me." The words sliced through her like a blade. Before she could respond, he grabbed his wallet and stormed out, leaving her standing in the wreckage of their honeymoon suite. The hours that followed were torture. Amina sat curled on the bed, gripping her knees, rocking back and forth as she whispered prayers into the void. She had taken every precaution. There was no way, no possible way, he could have contracted anything. Was there? When Khalil returned, the air around him was different. Darker. His expression was unreadable. He didn't look at her. Didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the floor. "Khalil," her voice wavered. "What did they say?" Silence. Then, in a voice so quiet it sent chills down her spine, he said, "I tested positive." The room spun. "No." She shook her head, her throat closing. "That's not possible. You can't. Don't." His voice was sharp enough to cut her. She swallowed, her hands trembling. "Khalil, I've been undetectable for years. You did this to me." The accusation hit her like a slap. "No. No, I swear, I didn't." But he wasn't listening. His breath grew ragged, his hands clenching into fists. "You ruined me, Amina." His voice cracked. "I have given my life to God. I have lived righteously. I have walked in His favor. And now, I am cursed." Tears spilled down Amina's face. "You are not cursed. God still loves you." Khalil let out a bitter laugh. "Does he?" His eyes burned into hers. Because it seems to me that I was tricked into marrying a Jezebel, and now I am no different from the sinners I condemn. Amina staggered back as if he had struck her. You think God is punishing you? She whispered. He lifted his gaze, and for the first time since he returned, she saw something that terrified her more than his anger. Despair. I was supposed to be chosen. His voice was hollow. I was supposed to be pure. Her chest tightened, realization dawning. This wasn't just about their marriage. This wasn't just about HIV. This was about everything Khalil had built, his identity, his ministry, his entire belief system. And in his mind, she had destroyed it all. The world outside their Miami hotel was still beautiful. The sun dipped low, setting the sky on fire with streaks of orange and pink. The ocean stretched endlessly, waves rolling in with quiet indifference. Somewhere, beyond these walls, people were celebrating, drinking, making love. Inside the suite, Khalil sat in silence. His hands trembled against his knees. His throat was dry, raw from the silent screams he had been holding back since he left that clinic. The test results echoed in his mind, a relentless, taunting whisper. Positive. No. That wasn't possible. That couldn't be possible. He had been faithful. He had been righteous. He had waited for Amina. Hadn't he? A sharp breath rattled from his chest as memories clawed their way up from the depths of his mind, memories he had buried beneath sermons, beneath the facade of holiness. The late-night counseling sessions with Sister Raquel, her tears staining his shirt before their prayers turned into something else. The quiet rendezvous with the church's choir director, moment of weakness in his office, the guilt suffocating but never enough to stop him. He squeezed his eyes shut. No. That wasn't his sin. This was Amina's doing. She had brought this filth into his life. She had cursed him. I'm a fitting rage. He moved so fast she barely had time to react. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat, slamming her against the wall. Amina gasped, her fingers clawing at his wrist, but his grip was like iron. You did this to me, he snarled, his voice thick with rage and something deeper, something unhinged. Amina shook her head frantically, tears spilling down her face. No, I swear to you, I didn't. I've been undetectable for years, you know what that means. I couldn't have. Lies. Khalil roared, tightening his grip until she choked. He threw her to the floor, and she crumpled in a heap, coughing, gasping for air. She tried to crawl away, but he was on her in an instant. His fists came down like a storm, 1, 2, 3 brutal hits to her ribs. A sickening crack filled the air. Amina screamed. But he didn't stop. Her jaw shattered beneath his knuckles, her lips split wide, blood splattering across the white carpet. He punched her again, and this time, 2 of her teeth flew from her mouth, landing near the nightstand. Amina sobbed, barely conscious, her body curling in on itself as waves of pain racked through her. Everything I built, Khalil seethed, dragging her up by her hair, forcing her to look at him through swollen, bloodied eyes. Everything I am, you destroyed it. Amina whimpered, her lips trembling. I love you, Khalil. His grip tightened in her hair. Love? His voice was laced with venom. Love? You ruined me. With a violent yank, he dragged her across the suite, her body scraping against the floor. She clawed weakly at his hands, but she had no strength left. He threw her against the nightstand, her head slamming against the sharp corner. Amina's body went limp, a pool of blood spreading beneath her. Still, it wasn't enough. His breath came in ragged, animalistic gasps as his eyes darted around the room. And then he saw it. The broken wine glass from earlier. He moved without thought, without hesitation. Amina barely stirred as he loomed over her, his silhouette blocking out the hotel light. Her lips parted, forming silent words, prayers, maybe, or please. It didn't matter. He brought the jagged glass down. The first stab went into her side, piercing flesh, muscle, organ. Amina's body jerked, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The second stab struck her chest. The third, her stomach. Over and over, he plunged the broken glass into her, hot blood spilling over his hands, splattering across his clothes. But he didn't feel it. He didn't feel anything. Not until he drove the glass deep into her throat. Amina's body convulsed, her eyes wide with horror. A gurgled sound bubbled from her mouth, blood, thick and dark, spilling down her chin. Her hands twitched weakly before falling still. Silence. The only sound in the suite was Khalil's ragged breathing. He stared down at what he had done. His beautiful wife, his blessing from God, lay before him, lifeless. His hands, the same hands that had baptized souls, had comforted weeping churchgoers, were now stained with her blood. And for the first time in his life, Khalil Barksdale realized. He was beyond salvation. The screams had echoed through the halls. Muffled at first, then rising into something raw, something agonizing, something that couldn't be ignored. Guests on the floor turned their heads, pressing ears to doors, hands hovering over their phones. Some whispered to themselves, a couple fighting, it'll pass. Others hesitated, torn between the polite instinct to mind their own business and the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. And then, silence. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, that pressed down on the walls and left a hollow stillness in its wake. It was hotel security who finally intervened. By the time they entered the suite, the room was a slaughterhouse. Blood soaked the plush white carpet, smeared across the walls, streaked across the nightstand where Amina's head had cracked against the wood. Her body lay twisted, mangled, her once beautiful wedding ring glinting under the dim hotel light. The wound in her throat gaped open, the blood no longer flowing but pooling, congealing. And on the balcony, Khalil sat. His suit, pristine only hours ago, was drenched, crimson staining the white fabric. His hands, trembling, clutched a Bible to his chest, its pages blotched with Amina's blood. He rocked back and forth, whispering words that barely carried over the soft breeze from the ocean. I cleansed her. She was unclean. He didn't flinch when the police stormed in. Didn't move when they shouted commands, guns drawn, voices sharp with urgency. Only when they grabbed him. Jerked his arms behind his back, pressed his face against the cool tile, did he speak again, louder this time, his voice hoarse, almost delirious. I cleansed her. She was unclean. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of the scene settling heavy in their bones. The kind of crime that made even the most hardened detectives pause. One officer, a younger man, turned away, fighting the bile rising in his throat. Khalil barely seemed to notice. Even as they hauled him out of the hotel, even as the flashing red and blue lights of Miami PD painted his skin in bursts of color, he remained lost in his own world, lips moving in silent prayer. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, his mugshot was everywhere. The prophet of Houston. The man of God. The groom from the viral wedding. A murderer. Religious leaders scrambled to make statements. Some condemned him outright, a false prophet, a wolf in sheep's clothing. Others hesitated, murmuring about forgiveness, about the enemy's influence. His congregation, once devoted, fractured overnight. Some still clung to the image of their pastor, unwilling to believe that the man who had led them in worship, who had preached about salvation and purity, could have done this. The media is twisting it. There has to be more to the story. Satan attacks those closest to God. But others had seen the crime scene photos. Had heard the recordings. Had listened to the 911 call from the hotel concierge, voice shaking as she reported the blood everywhere. And they knew. Their prophet was a monster. News anchors debated his mental state, psychologists analyzed his religious extremism, and social media exploded with discussions on purity culture, masculinity, and the dangers of unchecked power in the church. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because Amina was dead. And no amount of scripture could bring her back. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, former church members, legal analysts, everyone wanted to witness the fall of Khalil Jordan. The preacher who once stood on a pulpit, condemning sinners, now sat shackled at the defense table, his once proud posture diminished under the weight of his own hypocrisy. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted him as a fraud, a man who stood before thousands preaching morality while indulging in the very sins he condemned. Witness after witness took the stand, peeling back the layers of his double life. Former lovers, women from his own congregation, testified about their secret affairs, exposing the truth Khalil had fought so hard to keep buried. And then came the medical records. The prosecution revealed what Khalil had refused to accept: he hadn't contracted HIV from Amina. The timeline didn't match. His infection was older. The real source? One of his own indiscretions. He had damned himself, and instead of facing that truth, he had taken his rage out on his wife. The jury watched the crime scene photos in silence. The brutality was undeniable. Amina's shattered face, her broken body, the deep gash across her throat. The lead prosecutor's voice rang through the courtroom, sharp and unwavering. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of punishment. Khalil Jordan did not act out of temporary rage, he acted out of entitlement, out of the belief that his wife had defiled him, when in reality, he was the defiler all along. The defense tried to push back. They argued that Khalil had been overwhelmed by emotion, that the shock of his diagnosis had sent him into a temporary break. That he wasn't a cold-blooded murderer, just a man who had lost control. But the jury didn't buy it. The evidence was too strong, the crime too vicious. Amina had suffered for nearly an hour before she died. No blind rage lasted that long. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated. It took them less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty. The words hung in the air, final and inescapable. Khalil barely reacted. No outburst, no tears, just a vacant stare, as if he had already accepted his fate. The judge didn't hold back in sentencing. This was a crime of unspeakable cruelty. Amina Jordan suffered at the hands of a man who was supposed to love and protect her. Instead, he brutalized her, all to shield himself from the truth of his own actions. This court will not show mercy where none was given. Life in prison without parole. The gavel struck, and just like that, Khalil Jordan, the self-proclaimed man of God, was condemned to a cage for the rest of his days. As he was led out in shackles, there was no prayer on his lips, no scripture to cling to. Only silence. This case lingers in the mind long after the courtroom doors have closed. Amina Holloway's death was not just the result of one man's rage, but of deep-seated fear, secrecy, and the suffocating weight of religious hypocrisy. She believed love would protect her. She believed her precautions, her devotion, her silence would be enough. But in the end, the truth she feared most became her death sentence. Could this have been avoided? If Amina had told Khalil sooner, would he have left her instead of killing her? Or was his violence inevitable, driven by a need to maintain his own illusion of purity? And how much blame does Khalil's own hypocrisy hold in this horrific crime? What do you think? Let's discuss. If this story shocked you, like and subscribe for more cases that expose the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.